Boy, all of you got silent nicely, a nice time, perfectly timed. I like that. I wish my kids would respond that way. Let me be among the first to say good morning. My name is Anthony Moretti, and I'm an associate professor in the School of Communications and Information Systems here at Robert Morris University. Welcome to celebrating Communications Day, a day in which we promise we will not replay last night's basketball game, all right? Although I also promise you it will be a big topic of conversation on campus all day. For those of you who are here this morning, I joked that Romo was crowd surfing last night, and he was indeed. He is now safely back in wherever Romo lives and survived last night quite well. But our program today is one that will allow all of us to learn a little bit more about the First Amendment and appreciate its importance in American life. All of you have a program in front of you. I'm not going to say much about the program now, except to say everything taking place today is taking place on this floor. So you don't need to go outside. I know the weather, at least for now, knock on wood, is nice. But everything is taking place on this floor. If you need restrooms at any time of the day, they're in this back corner of the hallway, very easy to find. Lunch will be served for you. You'll eat in here as well. Where the breakfast was set up a few minutes ago is also where you will get a chance to grab some lunch in a couple hours. But again, everything is on this floor, so there's no need to get lost or try to figure out where you may need to go. But if you do need some help, you'll notice that many of us have our name tags on. Absolutely feel free to track one of us down. Anything from, hey, where do I find this, to I'm interested in learning more about that, and we will certainly help you. My comments this morning are going to be very brief, and they are actually going to be more of a series of thank yous to several people who made today possible. Inevitably, when you list some names, you know you left some names off the list. So if you don't hear your name and you're in this room, it is not intentional, I promise. The first person I want to thank is Dr. Heather Pinson, who is the interim chair of the Department of Communications. She is in the front row here. She also supplied the music this morning, so if you liked it, it's Heather. Carrie Monyo was in the room a minute ago. Where is Carrie? Carrie's in the back. There she is. Carrie is the RMU Century Media Student Media Advisor. Michael DeLauro is also in the back of the room. Michael is the director of our Academic Media Center. If you are interested in the documentary presentation that you'll see on your schedule, he is leading that at 11 o'clock, and then we'll also share some thoughts during a 1 o'clock session as well. Dr. Daria Jacobs, who could not be here today, she is the university's vice provost for research and graduate studies. I particularly mentioned those four individuals because they joined me in preparing a successful grant over the summer and in the early fall that led to all of us being here today. There are some other people I want to mention, and again, as I said, I know I'm probably forgetting someone, and that is absolutely accidental. Kurt Novak, who is the moonnewscloud.com webmaster. Ray Zapparoni and Joe Hale, who have been running around all morning from the Academic Media Center. A wonderful woman who many of you met when you walked in, Marianne Paletti, who's hiding in the back door there. Come on in, Marianne, it's okay. Marianne is the dynamite Department of Communications secretary, and she makes everything run smoothly. Several of our students are here as well. You'll see them in the front row. Many of them greeted you when you came in. A couple of my faculty colleagues are here as well. I see Professor Yvonne Bland in the front and Professor Sanaa, or Dr. Sanaa Park in the front as well. Is there any other faculty in the room I've missed? I think that's all the faculty. And the last person I want to introduce is the person who will replace me at the podium here in a moment, and that is Dr. Barbara Levine, who is the Dean of the School of Communications and Information Systems. Dr. Levine was named Dean of SCIS in 2008, and she's been part of the faculty since 1991. She was instrumental in developing the school's master's degree in communications and information systems, and she was the founder of the Doctor of Science of Information Systems and Communications program here at RMU. In 2006, she earned RMU's Outstanding Faculty Service and Commitment Award and the Distinguished Innovation in Technology Award. The following year, she received the Faculty Recognition Award, and I invite her to the podium now to introduce our morning keynote speaker. Dr. Levine.
Thank you, and I will give the second welcome of the morning. Welcome, we are so glad that so many of you could join us today especially after the wonderful evening we had last night. We are thrilled that all of you are here and that we can thank so many of you that are in this room. But one person who didn't thank himself is Dr. Moretti, who has been instrumental in every phase of today's event and spearheaded the grant which made the website that you'll be hearing more about possible. So thank you, Anthony, and we appreciate your efforts. Some of you know we began offering our own journalism program just a few years ago as a concentration in our communication department. We had one faculty member and at that time just a handful of students who helped produce a very modest print version of our student newspaper called The Century. Today the program has grown, attracting students from across the campus, and our student newspaper is now part of a converged media center where students apply the concepts and principles they learn in their classes to news writing and reporting through both traditional and through new media. Our students are also acquiring global perspectives by studying community journalism in other countries, like in Ireland, where they are blending photojournalism, narrative, and news reporting. They're about to apply all that they're learning to the community news website for Moon Township. And again, you'll be seeing and hearing more about that today. Our students, like journalists everywhere, are very interested in understanding censorship and constitutional rights. Today's speakers will broaden our understanding of First Amendment rights and provide us with insights about the challenges both our new students in the field are facing and even more seasoned journalists. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, our keynote speaker, Professor Mark Goodman. I'll tell you a little bit about him. Professor Goodman earned an undergraduate degree from the University of Missouri in Columbia and his law degree from Duke University. He is an expert in media law and First Amendment rights. For more than 2 decades, he served as executive director of the Student Press Law Center in the Washington, D.C. area. In addition, he served on the advisory council for the Department of Mass Media Arts at Hampton University, and he's been a guest faculty member and adjunct faculty member at several universities. In 2008, Professor Goodman joined Kent State University's School of Journalism and Mass Communication as the university's first night chair in scholastic journalism. He teaches classes in media law and master's courses for journalism educators. During his distinguished career, Professor Goodman has been the recipient of numerous awards, including First Amendment awards from the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and another from the Society of Professional Journalists. He also received the Intellectual Freedom Award from the National Council of Teachers of English, NCTE, some of you know it as, just to name a few. Please join me in welcoming Professor Goodman.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Uh-oh.
Yeah, we're going to be in the background.
You know, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'll tell you, I am going to leave plenty of time for you all to ask questions. I do hope that as we're discussing today, you'll be thinking about how this relates to issues that you're confronting in your own school. Let me tell you a little bit about you've heard a bit about my background. The Student Press Law Center is probably important to understand. For those of you who don't know, it is the only national organization that exists exclusively to provide free legal advice and assistance and information about media law issues to high school and college journalists. It's been around since 1974, and I always say to student journalists and their advisors, it is your best friend. Whenever you confront a legal issue or a question, whether it be about libel or access to public records or censorship, the Student Press Law Center is there to help you. Much of the information that you're going to see in my presentation today came from the Student Press Law Center, either information I gathered when I was there or things that I've gathered from them since. It's a wonderful resource, splc.org. I encourage you all to take a look at it. The second thing I will tell you is that the position I'm in now at Kent State University is kind of an unusual one. I mean, I teach classes to college journalism students, both masters and undergraduates, and occasionally PhD students as well. But my role there is specifically to be an advocate for the role of high school journalism, the important role that high school journalism plays, both in preparing journalists and preparing citizens. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes, but I'm here because I believe what you do is really important. More important than I'm betting some of you realize. So that's what the Center for Scholastic Journalism at Kent State is all about. That's why the university has a night chair in scholastic journalism. Okay, so the topic for today, you can't print that. You really can print almost anything if you go about it the right way. But I want to talk about what happens when you hear those words, you can't print that. You know, first of all, I hope everybody has at least heard of, even though, you know, research suggests most Americans can't repeat or mention the key principles of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. 5 freedoms embodied in 45 words, a very compact description put in our Constitution in 1791, yet today still is probably what more people around the world would say uniquely identifies us as American. Our strong protection for, among other things, specifically freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Now you may ask, well, you know, is this just a limitation on Congress? Because that's what it said. Over the course of our nation's history, as a result of amendments enacted to the Constitution after the First Amendment, the Supreme Court has said, in essence, you could read the First Amendment today as a limitation not just on Congress and the federal government, but on any branch of the government. There are limitations on any government official or government agency's ability to censor because the First Amendment in our Constitution requires that. It gives us all that kind of protection. You know, it's important, though, to know what that means. The First Amendment protection of the Constitution creates a division for students. Public schools are limited by the First Amendment because they're government agencies. They're required to comply with the First Amendment in the same way as city mayor or a sheriff or any other government official would be. But private schools, colleges and universities and high schools are not government agencies, and so they're not limited by the First Amendment in the same way public schools are. Now we're going to talk a little bit about why press freedom is important for students, but I will note that many private schools have voluntarily chosen through their own policies or sometimes as a result of state law have decided to protect student press freedom in some really important ways that make their protections not dramatically different from those of students at public schools. Well, how has the Supreme Court applied these First Amendment rights specifically to teenagers? One of the very first cases to raise this issue directly before the Supreme Court was a case decided in 1943 called West Virginia versus Barnett. Which involved a regulation in West Virginia that required all students to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. That's how we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Actually, this is before my time, but some of you might recognize that doesn't look like when we say the Pledge of Allegiance now, we usually put our hand flat over our heart. They didn't used to, at least in many places. When a little, political group called the Nazi Party came up with a salute that looked all too awkwardly similar, it changed in America to the way we said the Pledge of Allegiance. But in any event, West Virginia had a requirement that all students had to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. A group of students, a number of students in one particular family, objected saying, based largely on their religious beliefs, they were members of the Jehovah's Witness faith, that they pledged allegiance to no one but God. And they were not, based on their own beliefs, able to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Well, the school district said, and the state said, too bad, you're going to be suspended from school if you don't recite the pledge. So they eventually took their school to court. And the case progressed through the court system until in 1943, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision that recognized at some level, students in schools are entitled to the protection of the First Amendment. This was, the Supreme Court said, compelled speech, forcing students to express a view that they disagreed with. And the court said the First Amendment simply doesn't allow that. It was the first time the court had recognized that students, minors, in school, elementary and high school students, were entitled to some important First Amendment protection. But it wasn't until a significant number of years later, 1969, that the Supreme Court next directly dealt with the question of high school students' free expression rights and when school officials actually would be able to censor when students were expressing their own views. In that case, Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District involved these students and a friend of theirs, John and Mary Beth Tinker, and their friend Chris Eckert, who were among a group of students who decided that they, with their families, were going to wear these black armbands to school as a way of voicing their protest of U.S. involvement in the war in Vietnam. And in a lead up to Christmas Day sort of commemoration of all those who had died there. Well, the Des Moines, Iowa School District got wind of this and said, we're going to enact a policy that says no armbands allowed at school, period. They didn't single out these armbands in particular, but it was very clear their motivation for enacting the rule was this particular protest. The students came to school in their armbands and they were given a choice. You either take the armband off or we suspend you from school. Well, John and Mary Beth Tinker and their friend Chris Eckert went to court again over the course of a number of years. Their case progressed through the court system until in 1969, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down a decision upholding their right to engage in this protest, saying students do have the right to express themselves freely in public schools. This quote is probably one of the most famous First Amendment quotes involving young people that's ever been, made by the Supreme Court. Neither students nor teachers shed their constitutional rights to freedom of expression or speech at the schoolhouse gate. You still have protections at your school, you and your teachers. Many school officials today still have a hard time believing this is what the Supreme Court said all the way back in 1969. But you know, what the Supreme Court did in the Tinker case was even more important than recognizing First Amendment protection. The court also said, here is the context when school officials will be allowed to censor. The court created a test, a standard, a legal standard for when censorship could be permitted that hadn't existed up to that point. No one had really defined when those rights ended. And you know what the court said was this: school officials can only censor if they can overcome a pretty high First Amendment hurdle. And that hurdle is the school officials have to show that the speech they're objecting to, the expression they don't like, invades the rights of others. And by implication and through later court decisions, that's been defined to mean it libels someone, it invades someone's privacy, things like that. Or if the speech is going to create some kind of material and substantial disruption of school activities, some physical disruption of school activities. In subsequent cases, the courts have actually defined that generally to mean fighting, vandalism, something that actually incites students to engage in something that will physically disrupt the school. But unless the school could justify its censorship under one of those grounds, they would not be able to legally get away with it. That's what the Supreme Court said in Tinker. Well, Tinker set the stage for almost 20 years. I mean, Tinker was the legal limitation on student-free expression rights until the mid-1980s. And what it eventually ended up being is a much clearer explanation than had existed before of when school officials could censor and when they couldn't. You might think it sounds a little vague, but as the law goes, it actually ended up being much clearer than anything that had existed before that time. In the 1980s, though, things began to change. In 1985, the Supreme Court reached its next decision on student-free expression protection in a case called Bethel School District versus Frazier. This young man, Matt Frazier, was a student at a high school in Renton, Washington, not too far from Seattle, who gave a speech nominating a friend of his as a candidate for student government. I would read you that speech, but it might cause a substantial disruption in the classroom. I mean, basically what he did is use some very extended sexual puns and innuendos as a way to create a reaction from the audience and encourage support for his friend who was running for student government. The speech said something to the effect of, you know, I know a man who's firm in his character and he's firm in his pants. And he went on like that in a way that wasn't explicit, but was pretty silly. Well, interestingly enough, the school, not surprisingly perhaps, the school punished Matthew Frazier. He was not allowed to be a speaker at graduation, a position for which his classmates had voted him, that they allowed students to elect their own graduation speaker. He had been selected, but he was not allowed to speak. Now, Matt Frazier was this honor student. I mean, he was a really academic and activity star. He was a columnist for the student newspaper. He was very much a leader in his school. But this speech, the school said, was something they could punish. Well, Matt Frazier went to court contesting this. The school initially tried to argue that it was a substantial disruption, that his speech caused a substantial disruption. One teacher testified that at the assembly when he was giving the speech, students hooted and hollered, and some boys stood and simulated masturbation while the speech was going on. Another teacher testified that that happened at every school assembly, so there was no indication that Matt Frazier's speech had anything to do with it. In any event, when the case got before the Supreme Court, the court ultimately, for the first time, sided against the student and in favor of the school. And what the Frazier decision ultimately came to stand for is that vulgar, indecent, profane speech is not protected for students in a public school environment. That is a limitation beyond the Tinker limitation on student First Amendment protection. The next case that came chronologically is one I'm going to talk to you about in just a couple minutes. But I want to mention one other case first that's much more recent. The Morse versus Frederick case. Many of you may have heard of it, the Bong Hits for Jesus case. It's interesting to me how 1960s, the cases involve sort of important principles of political protest. The 1980s and the 2000s, the cases involve dumb stuff. You know, there's a message here, I think. But in the Morse versus Frederick case, Joe Frederick was a student at a high school in Juneau, Alaska, who decided on the day that the Olympic torch relay was passing through Juneau on its way to the Salt Lake City Olympics, the school let all the students out, and Joe Frederick and some friends of his stood across the street from the school building and held up this homemade banner, basically, you know, craft paper with duct tape letters on it that said, "Bong Hits, numeral for Jesus." When asked afterwards what he intended that to mean, Joe Frederick said he didn't think it meant anything. He thought it would get him on TV, which is why he made it. But His school principal was standing across the street on the school grounds, saw Joe and his friends, and Joe and the principal didn't have the best of relationships anyway. She came across the street, tore it down out of their hands, and then called, after the event, called Joe Frederick into her office and suspended him from school. The way he tells it is he was suspended for 5 days. He quoted Thomas Jefferson to her, and she increased his suspension to 10 days. She denies that that's what happened, but eventually he was suspended from school for 10 days based on holding up this banner. Well, Joe Frederick went to court again. And I have to note, you'll know, we're talking about a period of over 30 years, very small number of court cases. It's extremely rare for students to go to court, certainly to the Supreme Court, and it sometimes has more to do with who the student is and how willing to fight they are. But Joe Frederick took his case to court and eventually got to the U.S. Supreme Court, and once again, like in the Bethel versus Frazier case, the court desided with the school and upheld the school's right to punish. And in this case, what the court said was it believed that the particular dangers of the use of illegal drugs by young people was so well documented and so great that they were going to allow a limitation for that speech alone. Now, the court made clear that it wasn't talking about advocacy of the legalization of drugs or other discussions of drug policy. But what they said is if students are advocating the use of illegal drugs, that is not entitled to First Amendment protection. And for whatever reasons, they said it was reasonable for the school to decide that Bong Hits for Jesus was encouragement of the use of illegal drugs. Many people disagreed with that. In fact, some members of the Supreme Court said, we don't read it that way at all. So Morse versus Frederick, those are 3 of the 4 Supreme Court decisions that have defined your First Amendment rights in school. The next case is the one that I think has the most relevance to you after Tinker, the one that is most legally important, because it's the only case to directly involve the student press and the rights you're entitled to specifically as student journalists working on student media at your school. You know, that case, Hazelwood School District versus Kohlmeyer. Students in suburban high school in St. Louis, outside St. Louis, Missouri, published these stories that their school principal ultimately objected to and removed from the paper. Specifically, the story about teen pregnancy, that you can probably not read it, but on the right-hand side, the top of the page, included the accounts, the personal accounts of 3 students who had been given pseudonyms about their experience in being pregnant. They either had had a child or were about to have one while in high school. And the other story the principal objected to is the bottom right-hand corner, divorce's impact on kids. Students talking about how their parents' divorce had affected them. The principal said in both cases, these are stories that shouldn't have been included in the newspaper. In fact, he said divorce, you should never talk about divorce in a student newspaper. The students obviously felt, and their teacher felt very differently, that this was important journalism, topics that were important. In the pregnancy story, the school tried to argue this was somehow an invasion of the students' privacy. They weren't revealing any private information, and these kids all had children or were about to. You know, pregnancy usually isn't an inobvious condition. Contrary to the TV show, I Didn't Know I Was Pregnant, most people know, and most people who observe someone pregnant know it as well too. So the privacy argument didn't hold. But what the Supreme Court ultimately did was say, we are not considering this in the same light as we did the Tinker case. Basically, the court distinguished Tinker. The court said that Mary Beth Tinker's armband was not the same as a school-sponsored student newspaper. That was independent student speech and was still entitled to a high level of First Amendment protection. But school-sponsored content of this student newspaper, the Hazelwood E-Spectrum, was entitled to a lower level of First Amendment protection because it was tied to the curriculum, it was school-funded, it had a faculty-appointed advisor. Basically, what the court did is create a new hurdle that school officials had to overcome when the censorship occurred in this school-sponsored context. And that was the school has to show it has a reasonable, educationally based justification. All right, now what the heck does that mean? I mean, that actually turns out to be the million-dollar question in a lot of these cases, unlike the Tinker standard, which was a very high hurdle for school officials to overcome, and that the courts had pretty clearly defined had to be based on facts that some disruption was very likely to occur. The Hazelwood standard was much vaguer, much more subjective, and opened the door, at least potentially, to a much greater amount of censorship by school officials in that school-sponsored context. Hazelwood, though, didn't give schools unlimited license to censor. Censor. It applies only to school-sponsored speech. Students in non-school-sponsored context still have much stronger First Amendment protection, the court said. It doesn't apply to those student publications that have been designated as public forums, protected, where student content control has been provided by some kind of school policy. And also the Hazelwood standard itself, that reasonable educational justification that schools have to show, still requires schools to present some pretty good reason for censoring. And I want to describe one case that I think helps illustrate this. Dean versus Utica Community Schools involved this young woman, Katie Dean, who was at the time just a writer, a reporter, but when the case eventually got to court, she was the editor of her student newspaper at Utica High School in Michigan. Katie Dean co-wrote a story with one of her classmates about a lawsuit that had been filed against her school. In fact, I've got a copy of it here. By members of the community who lived adjacent to the school bus parking lot and garage. These neighbors basically said that the school was leaving buses idling outside or in this parking lot for hours and hours on end. And the diesel exhaust that these buses produced was making these neighbors sick. In fact, one of these people had been diagnosed recently with cancer and claimed that the diesel exhaust was a contributing factor that they believed. Well, this was a public record lawsuit. It had been reported very minimally in the local media, community media, but the student newspaper at Utica High School, the Arrow, decided, hey, this is important, we should write about it. And one of the reasons they decided that was because this school bus parking area was also right next to the high school athletic field and an elementary school playground. So they said, if their allegations are true that this is making people sick, what might the impact be on students in our school system as well? So they prepared this story. One of the best pieces of student journalism I've ever seen, despite the fact the school refused to talk to them, refused to comment about the lawsuit, they noted that this was not an open and shut case, that some of the claims these neighbors were making in their lawsuit were scientifically pretty difficult to prove. The courts hadn't recognized you're legally responsible for breathing diesel exhaust causing all these health problems. But nonetheless, when they finished the story, and there was an editorial and a cartoon that was to go along with it, an editorial cartoon, the school administration censored the whole kabang and said, you're not allowed to publish any of it. And what the court said in this case is, do I have it here? Oh, sorry. When Katie Dean eventually got to court, and her case only got to the federal district court level, it never went any higher, the district court said the school legally couldn't justify this censorship. First of all, the court said this publication has been operating in this school for over 20 years without censorship. The advisor, the teacher, testified to that. And the court said it is operating as a designated public forum where student editors make the content decisions. That alone exempts it from the limitations of Hazelwood. But the court said even if it were covered by Hazelwood, the school still has to show an educationally reasonable justification for censorship. And in fact, there isn't one. A factually accurate story about a lawsuit filed against the school legally simply can't justify censoring. And lastly, the court said this also was clearly an example of viewpoint censorship. The school censored this story because they didn't like that the school had given these community members a chance to express their own views. And the court said, in no context, even if your school is sponsored, can school officials engage in censorship of viewpoints. They have to allow all viewpoints to be expressed if they allow any to be expressed. So this case shows, even under Hazelwood, student publications still have some pretty significant First Amendment protection. Okay, so 4 grounds the Supreme Court has recognized for when school officials can censor: material and substantial disruption of school activities or invasion of the rights of others, material that's vulgar, lewd, or indecent, material that advocates illegal drug use. The good thing is that 2 and 3 categories, they're extremely rare. That doesn't come up very often. But then the last category for school-sponsored publication or school-sponsored expression, school officials can censor if the censorship is viewpoint neutral, not attempting to silence a particular view, and it's based on a reasonable educational justification. Okay, so why does it matter? Why do we care what First Amendment rights high school journalists have? If I'm not a high school journalist, why should it be important? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I firmly believe that high school students, that more Americans learn about the role of a free press in our society from experiences they have in high school than from any other experience they have. You know, research that we did at the Center for Scholastic Journalism a couple years ago showed that over 90% of schools in the country have some student media experience for students. 94% yearbooks, 64% newspaper, and TV and radio obviously are much smaller, but some student media experience. You know, despite the presence of student media in school and the recognition that there is some First Amendment protection, school officials especially, and sometimes even, teachers and community members just don't get it. There's a lot of misconceptions about the role of student journalism. Student media, they think, exists only to provide public relations for the school, or that what you're doing isn't real journalism, so it doesn't really matter. That airing dirty laundry or allowing people to criticize school policies or officials or anybody else is somehow disloyal, or that you're not really making the decisions. It's really some teacher or parent who's dictating everything you publish. Basically, the belief that you don't have the ability to come up with your own views. You're just parroting what other people have told you you have to express. Well, in contrast to that, our take is scholastic journalism is the best preparation for careers in journalism, for critical thinking skills, and for being a citizen in a democratic society where free expression is a value we really important. You know, there's a couple of interesting pieces of research. Almost 75% of high school students believe the First Amendment has no direct relevance to their lives, or they have no opinion about it, according to some research that was done a few years ago. Almost 50% believe the government should have the right to review stories in the community newspaper before it goes to press and remove things that are controversial. But student journalists don't believe that at the same levels. Students who've taken media classes or worked on a newspaper or yearbook are less likely to support that really, I think, very troubling view of the role of free expression and free press. Students with high school newspaper and yearbook experience, it shows, get higher GPAs in high school, higher GPAs in college, that get higher standardized test scores, and they have a stronger aptitude for leadership and community involvement. Research points that out. Furthermore, this is not nearly as well known as some of that other research, press freedom equals better journalism. You know, we had a graduate student at our university did a survey of the schools that over a number of years had won the biggest national awards in scholastic journalism, and found out that those schools that had no prior review, no direct censorship by an administrator, they were more likely to be protected from press or to win a national award than those schools that was not the case for. All right, the aftermath of Hazelwood. So Hazelwood limits The First Amendment protections for students gives greater ability of school officials to censor. Well, one thing that really quickly became apparent after the Hazelwood was California. California had a law in the books that had been there for years, largely ignored, that provided students free press protections. And not long after the Hazelwood decision, the State Commissioner of Education in California explicitly said, we're a Hazelwood-free zone. The limitations of Hazelwood don't apply in California because of this state law. Well, the result has been 7 states, or 6 other states, have joined California in enacting statutory protections for student free expression and student press freedom, rights that exist that are greater than those under the First Amendment. You know, I don't want to leave those of you who are college journalists out, even though you're at a private school and you know that distinction I've already made clear. College journalists have traditionally been entitled to much stronger First Amendment protection. The courts have historically said we can't treat them like teenagers, even though some of them may be. We have to treat them like adults. College and universities are the place where free expression is at its most important. But despite that fact, there are still battles and conflicts and unfortunately some really bad court decisions out there involving college student free expression. But you know, one of the things the courts at the college and university level have made clear is even indirect forms of censorship are not allowed. Using funding as a mechanism to censorship, for example, to censor is not permitted. The courts have said at college and universities as well. All right, you know, again, I come back to why does this all matter? Why do we care? Why do I care specifically? You know, there are more high school student newspapers in this country than there are community daily and weekly newspapers combined. Again, this is our research from 2011. Our estimate, based on our random national sample, there are there are over 11,000 high school student newspapers in the U.S. At that time, there were a little less than 8,000 commercial daily and weekly newspapers, and that number is going down. In contrast, the number of high school publications is either steady or increasing, the research indicates. We hopefully will know that in a year. Ultimately, what I think this really is all about is what we're teaching you about life in this great democracy. The values of free expression and press freedom are fundamental. And in the Dean versus Utica case, the judge who wrote the opinion in that case, Arthur Tarnow, I thought said it so eloquently, and I note the highlighted comment here. If the role of the press in a democratic society is to have any value, all journalists, including student journalists, must be allowed to publish viewpoints contrary to those of state authorities without intervention or censorship by the authorities themselves. If we expect you to be defenders of the First Amendment when you graduate, you have to be taught how to be a defender of the First Amendment and experience the First Amendment when you're in high school. All right, let me stop there. Thank you all very much.
We have about 10 minutes or so for questions. I've got a couple of our students, where are they, who were helping out this hour? I forget, I don't have the list in front of me. If one of you can grab one of these and sort of circle around the room. Again, we've got about 5-10 minutes or so. And if you ask a question, give us your full name and the high school you go to so that we have a better chance of letting you introduce yourselves. So, got about 5 minutes for questions.
Anybody have a question? You know, I would love to, if you have a particular situation or issue that you've confronted or you anticipate confronting in your own school, I'd be more than happy to talk about that. I'm also happy to talk about any of the cases or controversies or conflicts that I've mentioned here as well. Anybody have a question?
Don't be bashful. You guys are, like I said, this group over here is trying to find the right person to do it. Go ahead. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, I'm playing on. All right. I'm Josh Petrus. I'm from Katanning Senior High School. Hi, everyone else. Me and my buddy Colby here, this kid right here, we recently made a film called 1134. It was for the TBT award competition. You don't know about it, but we played it as a morning bulletin just to show everyone what we decided to, make, and we kind of got some bad reviews on it, and some teachers thought it was great, and some students' parent brought it up to the school board without going directly to the principal first, and there's huge controversy there. And
Well, let me ask you, what do they object to? Tell me what was in it that people
It
didn't
was-
like.
it was a zombie film, and there were fake guns in it, but you can clearly tell they had orange tips.
Right.
It was no doubt about it. What? And they just, I don't know, they just didn't really see it as clearly as we did.
Well, let me offer two thoughts in relationship to that. First of all, there is always going to be conflict, especially when you've got people of different generations evaluating content decisions, that are being made. I mean, you're not going to always agree with your parents or your teachers or your school administrators about what is good or what is appropriate. That said, I will tell you, one of the challenges that these court decisions give us is the requirement that you have to think about what the reaction and consequences could potentially be, because that's the way you anticipate, can we legally defend ourselves if we have to. I mean, for example, if you're going to depict something that is going to cause a really, potentially bad reaction, make sure that people get some feedback from people about how you can minimize that reaction before. But the other thing I will tell you is that, again, there are 4 legal grounds that school officials can give. Material disruption, is it going to cause a physical disruption or invade somebody else's right? Is it does it advocate illegal drug use? Does it include vulgar or indecent language? Or if it's school-sponsored, can they present some educational justification? And that's the question that probably is most relevant in your context. I mean, it's hard to say in the abstract without seeing it, but I'll tell you, if you think your work is artistically sound, stand up and defend it, and say, hey, we think this is good and here's why. Other questions anybody has?
Just speak loudly, not sure that was working.
Okay.
I was curious actually, why are private schools held to the same constitutional law as public schools are?
Well, it's all about the way the First Amendment was written. The reason the First Amendment was put in our Constitution was because of our fear of government censorship. Because private schools are technically not government agencies. That they may get a lot of government funding, but they're not agencies of the government. They're not limited by the First Amendment in the same way. Now, that said, there are a number of places where private schools have been themselves volunteered to be limited. California, for example, enacted a state law explicitly providing free expression and free press protections to private school students. But a number of private colleges and universities, and even a lot of private high schools, have adopted their own policies that effectively become like a contract and limit their ability to censor. But the reason the First Amendment doesn't apply is because they're not the government, and the First Amendment is solely a limitation on the government.
We get a round of applause for Professor Mark Goodman.
Thank you.
Mark, before you run off, here is a small token of our appreciation.
Thank you very much.
Mark and many of our guests will be sticking around at least, we hope, through the lunch hour. So if there's a question you still want to ask and didn't get a chance to sneak in, don't worry about it. Mark is not going to run away too far. We'll be able to get other questions in. Now, our breakout sessions are going to begin in just a couple of minutes, so I want to call your attention to the schedule one more time. There are 3 of them that will begin at 11 o'clock. If you want to take part and listen in and also have a chance to ask questions about the Steubenville and social media issue, stay in this room here. If you're attending Professor Michael DeLauro's session on documentaries, then you're going to walk out these doors on the right-hand side here and go to Dining Room C, and that's all of about 20 feet from here, so it's not too far from here at all. And finally, if you're going to take part in Carrie Monio's live webcast session, then again, walk out those same doors to your right here, go out to Dining Rooms A and B, and again, that's about 20 feet from here. Restrooms, remember, are on the back if you need them. Take advantage of those during any point in the morning. After the breakout sessions end at 11:50, you'll grab lunch and come back in here. So, and remember, faculty and staff and students have those name tags on. If you have questions, please ask. Otherwise, move on to the breakout sessions.